Hello, everybody, and welcome. Going to put the glasses on to make you know that I'm serious about this. Welcome along, everybody, and it is the evening of the 15th of April, and we are back with you again from an undisclosed location, coming to you with a live stream, and here we are tonight. This, as advertised, is the aforementioned Q and A. We will be taking your questions for tonight. I've had at least five that I've recorded on the chat already, so keep them coming there. And I'll start off though by just mentioning something that popped up today on my feed, which is the tour engaged in by Saint Bernard of Vermont, who is traveling around the place and making long-winded excuses for U.S. imperialism. Now, what I mean by this is that he's on this ridiculous so-called anti-oligarchy tour, and he is going around still making excuses for the Israeli regime, still trying to pretend that it is merely Netanyahu who is the problem, still trying to pretend that it is merely Trump that is the problem with US imperialism. Now, the only way to describe this is social imperialism and social chauvinism, which is what Sanders has always been. There wasn't the moment when Bernie Sanders went bad. Bernie Sanders was always bad. You know, the kind of politics he represents has always been bad, just as the kind of politics that Jeremy Corbyn represents has always been bad, has always been rotten. In fact, in many ways, Sanders and Corbyn are more rotten than the more honest reactionaries, because what they do is peddle illusions to people. And the illusion that Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn peddle to people is that they are some great flaming left wingers, and that there is some democratic socialist, a term I absolutely despise, way to socialism via bourgeois parliamentarism, either via the House of Commons in Corbyn's case, or by the US Congress in Sanders' case. They are both there to peddle the worst kind of illusions and to ideologically disarm the working class. That's what Sanders and Corbyn are all about. So that Sanders will be going on a tour where he's promoting the presidential aspirations of that absolute brain dead Ocasio-Cortez, and making apologetics for the mass slaughter engaged in by the American imperialists overseas, should be no surprise. This is what he was always like. I understand that many people went through the Sanders experience in their way to Marxist-Leninism, which is good that you all went through that, just as it's good that I went through the mistakes and the errors and the disasters of the Trotskyite and the Corbyn experience, and realized that the whole thing needed to be rejected at the end. Making political mistakes is part of reaching maturity, especially in a time of profound reaction. But continuing to make those mistakes, continuing to elevate someone like Sanders or someone like Corbyn as anything other than what they are, which is apologists for imperialism and social chauvinists, that is not a mistake anymore. That is an act of deception. First of all, you are deceiving yourself. And second of all, you are deceiving the masses, or you are attempting to deceive the masses. I don't think the American masses or the masses in perfidious Albion are going to be deceived by Corbyn and Sanders. Their moment has passed. But they are being, well, Sanders certainly is being promoted for the reasons of trying to redeem the beshitted reputation of the Democratic Party in the way that he has always done. So reject the siren song of reformism, whether it comes in its American form or its British form or its French form or German form. So we will now turn to some questions we've had in so far. Had a few so far that have come in while we're doing the musical introduction. I hope you enjoyed the return of the music. So we will now get to some questions. So this is from Florida Man, and reads as follows: Should communists work to win over reactionary workers, and how to do that without being accused of quote unquote tailism? So the answer to this obviously is yes. Workers who hold reactionary points of view, well, depending upon where you are in the US or old perfidious Albion, reactionary points of view will be all that many workers hold, or a series of reactionary points of view, or a mass of contradictory points of view, because this is just the stage that we're going through. The disappearance of proletarian politics as a distinct trend, as a distinct thing in the masses, has made it so that a whole generation, or maybe two generations of workers, have grown up knowing nothing but the propaganda of the bourgeoisie, and with very, very few countervailing tendencies. So if we're talking about workers holding reactionary points of view, it's inevitable that almost any worker we run into, whether it's a worker who describes himself or herself as a liberal, a conservative, or even a socialist, they're going to have a variety of reactionary points of view. Like, you could meet like a worker who describes themselves as some kind of socialist, and they could be a social chauvinist. They could be a social imperialist. So that in itself would be a problem. They might like trade unions. They might think that more workers should be organized in trade unions. They might support reindustrialization. They might support it in a very confused pro-capitalist way. They might want to see the return of American or British social democracy. Those are all in themselves reactionary points of view to a greater or lesser degree. And so we should bear in mind that even those workers who are already on the left, are going to be filled with, in imperialist countries, various pro-imperialist points of view. And so when people ask this question, and I'm not saying this is Florida Man's assumption, when people ask the question, should you reach out to reactionary workers, they're probably thinking of like the Trump guys, the devotees of Nigel Farage, or people more reactionary than them. But I think the broader point to make is that most workers now, following two generations of just unmitigated, uncontested anti-communist propaganda being pumped into everybody's head from day one, all workers are going to have a variety of reactionary points of view. Now, I think that what the question is driving at, though, is more those who are open reactionaries. So the out and proud Trump people, the even pro-fascist people within the proletariat, should we reach out to them? Well, ultimately, we're going to have to. As I said, every worker who we encounter is going to, unless they're already a communist, is going to have a variety of reactionary points of view. And Lenin, and in his advice to the Bolsheviks many years ago, said that you have to go where the workers are. Now, if the workers are in reactionary trade unions, you have to go and work within and around reactionary trade unions, because you as a communist have to go and speak to and try to win over the working class where the working class is. So if the working class in your particular country, or if you're in the United States, your particular state, is organized around the trade union movement, then you need to go to the trade union movement. If the working class is organized via different reactionary cultural organizations, then you need to go into the reactionary cultural organizations. If the working class is organized even in fascistic organizations, like the Black Hundreds back in Russia in the pre-revolutionary period, then, as Lenin advised the Bolsheviks, then you even need to go there. Later, I think it was Dimitrov who advised that the communists should need to go into even the fascist Italian corporations, where the Italian fascists tried to merge labor and capital into one corporation working for the nation. All bullshit, of course. Or I think it was also later that Dimitrov advised that communists should go and work in the Nazi labor front, because if workers are organized there, then communists need to be there to win them over and away from the fascist influence. And now that was all done, of course, at a time when there was the Communist International and the Soviet Union existed. But the general point still stands that where workers are organizing and coming together in any way, communists need to go there and try to influence them in some way or other towards our point of view. Now, it might be that you have to do that a little more subtly in some places than others, but how to avoid the accusations of tailism. Now, this is an important point, because there is such a thing as tailism. Social democrats engage in it. All kinds of like revisionists engage in it. Now, what defines tailism is that what you are doing in your approach to like trying to win over reactionary workers is basically you're not contesting the basis for their reactionary points of view at all. I mean, and there is approaching things subtly, in that you don't just go in and scream, "You're a racist" at people or something like that. But you do consistently bring out the need for the unity of the working class and for the incompatibility of the interests of the working class with the interests of the ruling class. Those are two things that absolutely have to be underlined to any group of workers, whether no matter how reactionary they are. Because first of all, it's a point that needs to be understood by the workers if their class consciousness is ever to evolve, and also it's something that they probably know anyway on some level, but they've sort of buried it under layers of ideological bullshit that the bourgeoisie's given them. So if you tell a bunch of workers that their interests and the interests of the rich factory owners, property owners, landowners aren't compatible, they probably know that. They just don't know politically what to do with that. And so they get lost in like reactionary points of view. But you have to bring out that fact, especially with workers who are tied to ultra reactionary groups, that the people who are funding and organizing the ultra reactionary groups are ultimately the ruling class. And the ruling class will never be interested in the welfare of the working class at all. They're interested in tricking the working class. They're interested in dividing the working class. So we need to bring out the incompatibility of interests of the working class with the ruling class, but also the need for the unity of the working class, regardless of race, ethnicity, cultural background, religion, etc. Inside any particular country, the unity of the working class needs to be established and needs to be relentlessly emphasized in our approach. And that means breaking down barriers to that. That means getting or trying to get workers to realize that ultimately, even if they despise the workers next to them, or even if they've been brought up to despise another element of the working class, that they have infinitely more in common with them than they do with the bourgeois propagandists who are running like whatever reactionary organization that they are attached to. Now, that is the basis for a proper approach to this question, putting forward demands which promote the unity of the working class and drive home for workers the incompatibility of their interests with those of the ruling class. So let's use an example. Let's use the housing question as an example. We're seeing this go around quite a lot, both certainly in old perfidious Albion, and also I think in the United States as well. You get like different ultra-reactionary organizations of various kinds putting around the idea that the way to solve this is like housing just for whites or defend white communities and stuff like that. What needs to be driven home is the fact that the only approach which can solve like the housing question is an approach based on the unity of the working class and the incompatibility of our interests with those of the ruling class. Meaning that the only correct way to approach this is to say that every worker deserves, by dint of the fact that they are a worker, a secure home, and that goes for the entire working class. And this gets us over the propaganda put around by the reactionaries that is based on the myth and the lie of a scarcity of resources. See, one of the reasons why the racist groups are, or I should say, the racialist groups, I should use that term, the racialist groups are making hay at the moment is that they're, with the housing question, is that they're drawing from this idea that there is a scarcity of housing. And therefore they're saying, well, housing is scarce, therefore we need to protect what public housing we do have for the right people, i.e. the white people. And that sort of any reactionary point of view like that needs to be contested, and we need to be emphasizing the point that the entire working class requires decent housing and needs decent housing and a strong, unified community to live in. And you don't get that via the paltry solutions of the racialists. The only way you get that is by unifying and fighting for the demand for good homes for all that are provided publicly, that are not subject to the market, that are outside of market relations, and that are in communities which are democratically controlled by the elected representatives of the working class, all of the working class. And that the only way you can get that realizable aim is by unity in the face of the ruling class. And that's what needs to be emphasized. And we need to point out relentlessly on that issue that it's not a scarcity of resources, it's a deliberately created shortage in order to boost the house price bubble which is, of course, beneficial for bankers, building owners, landlords, etc. And those people are our enemies, our real enemies. And so, where you see, we should take those demands to all groups of workers and say that what we are putting forward is the truly revolutionary line, which is that the unity of the entire working class can not only achieve these aims, but can overthrow the parasitic ruling class. And are all workers who are enamored with reactionary points of view going to go for our position? Are they going to accept our position straight away? No. The answer is no, they're not, for a variety of reasons, because it goes against everything they've been told for their entire lives. And people don't give up things they've been told for their entire lives until their consciousness evolves or the material reality pushes their class consciousness forward. And then that combines with the work done by communists to build ourselves in the working class and to build our organization, so that when even workers who are sold on racialist points of view, realize that they have been wrong and they've been misled by these con men, that we have an organization that is ready to bring them on and organize them and take advantage of the fact that their consciousness has evolved to the point where they're now ready to see the reality of class relations. So that's the reality of what we need to do, and that is not an easy thing, but that is how you avoid tailism. Tailism would be something like George Galloway does. Galloway does tailism all the fucking time, to be honest. It's part of the reason why I left the WPB in the first place, because it is tailism. So his approach to the immigration question is reactionary, and it is tailism, because what he does is he agrees with the reactionary point of view that it is immigration itself that is the problem. That's what, rather than contesting it. Now, again, it depends which broadcast Galloway does and what opportunistic thing he says on any given day. But that's his politics. His politics has always been tailism. Like, if there's a reactionary trend, he'll run after it. Same is true, of course, in the United States with someone like Sanders, who does all kinds of reactionary nonsense. Someone like Corbyn. All social democrats do tailism in various different ways. The difference with a communist politics is that what we try to do is try to put forward like day-to-day demands that the workers can see and understand and think that the system should be able to satisfy. Then we should demonstrate through the struggle why the system can't satisfy it and why revolution is a necessity. That's a difference between a revolutionary and a reformist, between a communist politics and a revisionist or reformist or a reactionary politics or a tailist politics. A tailist uncritically accepts reactionary points of view within the working class. A communist goes into the working class knowing full well they are going to face reactionary points of view, engages with the working class persistently and with patience over a long period of time to try and bring workers around to the revolutionary perspective, whilst never giving way to the reactionary trends, but also never condemning the workers who hold reactionary points of view, because we understand where those points of view come from and also that they can be overcome. Right. So, second question, and this is from Edward. In a socialist state, should the Communist Party ban trans gender surgeries, etc.? I would say that in post-revolutionary societies, it wouldn't be, this stuff would die off, mostly. And I'll tell you why. As I have explained on many occasions before, and as my party, the CPGB-ML, has explained in multiple pamphlets issued over a number of years now, and articles as well, transgenderism or gender ideology is something which emerges in the rottenness of late capitalism or late stage imperialism. It's based on a profoundly reactionary point of view as to what constitutes a woman and what constitutes a man. And these are the view that the gender ideologues have of this is one which is constructed by bourgeois ideology. And so and this is why you get all this stuff about, and also it takes root in a soil which is fertilized by the foul pollutants of alienation, foul pollutants of like late stage capitalism. So profound alienation, atomization, a promotion of like the most kind of reactionary individualism that is sold to people as liberation. The influence of like various forms of pornography, the influence of like reactionary trash culture. All of this makes up the background to why gender ideology has become the thing that it is, that and deliberate promotion by the ruling class. But at heart, why I think it would disappear, though it would probably need to be struggled against in a post-revolutionary society, why it would not be the thing that it is now, is that suddenly all the alienated and, quite frankly, rather ill people that this appeals to, the number of them will be significantly decreased, because suddenly, in a post-revolutionary society, the entire proletariat would be unified in a struggle to build a new society. And that what that can do in terms of the removing the feelings of alienation and the feelings of depression, the feelings of purposelessness, the feelings of that people have of not fitting in with this society, that cause people to go down the transgenderism route. Well, all of that will be significantly eroded. The power of that will be significantly eroded by all these working class people coming together to actually fight for socialism, fight for the revolution. That will give all of these alienated and purposeless people who quite rightly feel out of place in this society, but who go down the wrong route of explanations, just like any reactionary worker does. Suddenly they will have a purpose, and suddenly they will be able to find a place in the struggle for socialism, and they will be able to find a place in the building of the socialist order. That will cure the feelings of like alienation that dominate today, and and all the other illnesses that stem from that. Also, in a post-revolutionary society, men and women will be able to develop freely in ways that are removed from the constraints of the decaying bourgeois society. And now, what do I mean by this? It will mean that the ludicrous, pornographied, stereotyped view of womanhood that this reactionary culture has now, and the ludicrous stereotyped view of what manhood is, will start to erode. Now, again, what do I mean by this? Over the last 30 years, since really the counter-revolutions of the 1980s and early 1990s, the position of proletarian women in particular has, I would argue, worsened because of the disintegration of the workers' movement. The forward march of labor, shall we say, was derailed by the counter-revolutions, and all kinds of reactionary trends came back. And so reactionary trends that typically affected like the female half of the proletariat returned, albeit in new forms. So it wasn't the case that capitalism either could or even wanted to restore the kind of relations between the sexes that existed prior to the 1960s in a place like perfidious Albion, for instance, or the United States. But what returned was like various reactionary points of view as to relations between the sexes. There was various attempts to restore like what the imagined dominant male past was. You see this all the time from like manosphere guys, various different online influences trying to sell the idea of a traditional patriarchal family, which just doesn't exist anymore. It can't exist because capitalism requires that both the man and the woman in any domestic situation are both working. Now, what point am I reaching with this, you might ask? The point is that like the view of women as promoted by the culture has worsened over the last 30 years. As the bourgeoisie attempts in various different ways to stabilize the situation facing itself. And part of them want to go back to a situation where they put women back in a box. But the actual reality of capitalism is that women are absolutely required to be half of the proletariat in a literal sense, and that they're no longer just doing unpaid labor in the home. They are laboring quite literally for the profits of capital as well, and capital requires that. Some elements in the ruling class, though, are enamored with the idea that, get the women back in the kitchen, but they can't have that. So you get this sort of cycling through different reactionary points of view and the promotion of different reactionary points of view with regard to the relationship between men and women. Post-revolution, what would that mean, though? It would mean that all of that could be not immediately overcome, because you have to struggle against long-term ideological trends, and consciousness always lags behind material reality. But what it would mean was that, as with the Soviet Union, as with China, as with Korea, that suddenly sexual stereotypes based on differences of sex, would disappear. Like the expectations of facing both men and women, and the expectations of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, would all start to fall away. So that people who perhaps grow up homosexual or lesbian and would be confused about what that would mean, or either men or women who feel slightly uncomfortable in the traditional fitting into the traditional norms of their sex, would actually not feel that they'd have to cut themselves to pieces and go through surgeries or drug themselves up to find a place in society. That's why it would die off, because suddenly there were differences based on ideas over what a job a man should do, what job a woman should do, what role a man should play, what role a woman should play. All of that would start to fall away. Yes, there would still be some things that some professions that would be predominantly male, some professions that might be predominantly female. But the barriers that exist to that, and the barriers that are put there by capitalism, would start to fall away. And yes, there would still be the need for a struggle to advance the rights of women, to get over the barriers put in the way of proletarian women under capitalism. There would still need to be a struggle, an ideological and cultural struggle against pornography, against all the filth and rot that exists within late period capitalist culture, which fuels things like transgenderism. But that struggle could then be had knowing that the material reality has changed and that there is a degree of security for all people. And therefore, the appeal of reactionary trends like transgenderism would be significantly reduced to the point where it would almost be non-existent. And that's the point. The point is that all the things that make gender ideology into the, shall we say, the hit that it has been, including its promotion by the ruling class, would all fade away to the point where you would then be able to actually construct the new man and the new woman, the new socialist man and the new socialist woman, in a way that is freed from the alienation and the horrors of late-stage capitalism and the rot of the late-stage capitalist culture, and be able to stride forward to struggle against all of its invidious after effects as well. And that would make reactionary things like transgenderism much, much less appealing. And I think it would disappear over time as the new and true relations between men and women grew up in the new society. Again, it would be a struggle over a generation or two to have the ruinous effects of late stage capitalism removed, and it would depend upon material and ideological progress. But at least we would have the material base under which that struggle could be successfully waged. Right. It's from Daniel. What would your recommendation be as a starting point to reading Hoja? Interesting question. Hoja is a fascinating figure because he is, on the one hand, a heroic revolutionary who led the struggle to build socialism, and very successfully for a long time, in a very backward country in the form of Albania. And there was huge and magnificent achievements by the Albanian communists over a long period of time. But it's also true that Hoja made a number of mistakes, and he wasn't alone in doing so. The CPC, Communist Party of China, also made ultra-left mistakes in that same period. Excuse me for just one moment. That proves that it's live. There was a sneeze. So, Hoja also made mistakes. And the mistake that he shared with the CPC was the theory of social imperialism as applied to the Soviet Union. A terrible mistake by the CPC and by Hoja and the PLA that really derailed a lot of his otherwise very astute points about the Khrushchevite revisionists. So, in terms of what I would recommend as a starting point to read, his work on his recollections of his time with Stalin are very much worth reading. There's a whole book on that. You can find all of these on the Marxist Internet Archive, in actual fact, which, for all that it's a Trotskyite-run site, has done a very comprehensive job of gathering Hoxha's work. I would read, his recollections of his time, the times that he met with Stalin. I would recommend also, I think the book's entitled The Anglo-American Plot Against Albania. That's very good. I would recommend his work on the Khrushchevites, even with the proviso that the theory of social imperialism is completely and utterly wrong. And also that the Albanians made mistakes, just as the Chinese did in that period, in responding to Khrushchevite revisionism. And it's not a surprise that they made some mistakes, given that they were up against a trend which they were convinced, with some degree of justification, was a dire threat to the communist movement. And indeed, Khrushchevite revisionism was, because of its profoundly anti-revolutionary, anti-communist elements that it had within it. But also that Khrushchevite revisionism could be defeated, that there were different trends within the CPSU that could be encouraged and worked with, and that walking out of all the international communist organizations actually gave the worst elements of Khrushchevite revisionism kind of what they wanted, which is that they wanted to, first of all, split the international communist movement, and they did that successfully, partially through their own actions, partially because of the mistakes of others. And also that they wanted to isolate the struggle to within the Soviet Union so that they could then start to struggle against the revolutionary elements in the USSR, which they did over a 25-year plus period, and ultimately horribly successfully. So always read Hoxha with the proviso that this is a great revolutionary, one of the great revolutionaries of the 20th century, but that also he was a man like any other who made some profound mistakes and some very damaging mistakes. Ultimately, Albanian socialism fared no better than the rest of the people's democracies in the Soviet Union. Collapsed. The question has to be asked as to why. It's not all Ramiz Alia's fault, or any of the other leadership that took over after Hoxha's death. There has to be a question asked as to why a country that had made as many great strides as Albania had towards building socialism was destroyed so easily. Again, questions have to be asked as to what Hoxha's legacy is. But read the books that I've suggested, and read more from Hoxha about and from others about the development of socialism in Albania, and draw your own conclusions. I mean, Hoxha also put forward some ludicrous points of view by the end of his life, that, as did the Hoxhaists, that China had never been socialist, that Mao was a comprador, all kinds of really crazy stuff with no real material basis for it. So approach Hoxha with interest and respect, but also with caution that the man got a lot of things wrong. Okay. How would I respond to claims of historical revisionism over the Soviet intervention in Poland in 1939, which is a response to some remarks I made the other day, and that's from YepX. Comes from, I think YepX's question referred to from Ukrainian so-called nationalists. They're not nationalists in reality. Are screaming that the Soviets invaded Poland. I would say, first of all, if these people regard themselves as socialists, tell them to read the Grover Fur article that I recommended. But also bear in mind that there's some people you're just never going to win over. Just not. I mean, there's some people who are just determined to be wrong and determined to be as out there and reactionary as possible. So bear that in mind. You're not going to win over some people. On the grounds of the historical revisionism, I would just say this. What part of what I argued is wrong? What part of what Fur argues in his article is wrong? Is it the case that the Soviet Union and the Soviet leadership offered an anti-Hitler coalition to the European states, the French and the British and the Poles at various different points, and that the Poles turned it all down? That's true. What about the fact that the Poles collaborated with Hitler in the dismembering of Czechoslovakia? The reactionary Polish government did. That's true. What about the fact that the Polish government fought the war against the Nazis incompetently? That's true. It's also confirmed even in the memoirs of Nazi generals like von Manstein that that was true. Is it true that the Polish government had ultimately capitulated and fled the country by the time that the Soviets rolled into the east? That's true. Is it true that the Soviets evacuated many thousands of Jews into the Soviet interior, enabling them to survive what would have been a potential mass slaughter? Well, that's true. So all of these things are provable facts that we can put together here. So what is it that these so-called these fake nationalists, be they Polish or Ukrainian, are actually putting forward? They're reasserting their own fantasies, their anti-communist fantasies. That's what they're doing. And some of these people can be won over. Many of them, though, are so far gone on this bullshit that they'll remain wrapped up in this until the revolution comes to their countries. So go through the facts one at a time. Establish the facts, point them out, and argue patiently. And if you can't win them over, then don't worry too much about it. Maybe you've sowed some seeds that will mature and come into bloom later on when the material reality changes or their consciousness catches up with the material reality. But for some people, you're arguing with bitter reactionaries, and if it's online, sometimes people who are paid to be NAFO bots, people who are paid to be fake Ukrainian nationalists, etc. So make your points, draw truth from facts, and explain patiently. But again, don't be surprised if certain people just never agree with you. Also, it's true that like the Polish, as I believe it was Pavel who commented on YouTube, that there was significant problems with the political education that was carried out in the old Polish People's Republic. They tied themselves in knots trying to find a narrative for the existence of the current borders of the Polish People's Republic. And within the PUWP, Polish Workers' Party, there were different, very dodgy trends at various different points. Various mistakes were made in the education process. So that's part of the reason why there is a view in like places like Poland that is not favorable towards the USSR. There's some historic weaknesses of Polish communism and the Polish People's Democracy there that also it helps encourage this point of view. Right. Just realised I had to ban a troll in the chat who is getting very animated about something. So if you come on here and act like a dickhead, I'm just going to ban you, or one of the moderators will ban you, and you will remain banned until you learn how to behave yourself. It's the way I handle all online disputes, which is if you can argue any case you want to, you can even come on here and be a fascist if you want to, as long as you behave with a degree of decorum. If you can't do that, then you get banned. There you go. So you've received the treatment that you asked for there. So kindly fuck off and don't return until you've learned how to behave yourself, basically. And when you have learned how to behave yourself, perhaps you'll realize how much of an idiot you were. Don't take it too personally, though. I was an idiot when I was 18 as well. It was part of the privilege of youth. You know, you can be an idiot for a while and get away with it. But one does need to mature eventually. Okay, so criticisms of other organizations that claim to be Marxist-Leninists. This is also a question from YepX. Is there a sort of repository of information on this? There's plenty of articles on my own party's website, CPGBML, dealing with this. There's also the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, which I would encourage everybody to check out, where there's a lot of really good information about the about the role of like the KKE, about other organizations which proclaim themselves to be communist, but ultimately um, are incapable of actually consistent Marxism, Leninism. So I would encourage everybody to read the articles on the World Anti-Imperialist platform as a good way of gauging where these reactionary trends are. Okay. Tim Gray asks, why didn't the strong communist movement develop within Ireland? Excellent question, and one that I feel I don't quite know enough about the history of the Irish Communist parties, plural, to fully and properly answer that. I will put forward a couple of points of view, though, with the proviso that I think I still need to learn more about this. Um, First of all, I would say that the the communists in Ireland suffered from getting literally beheaded very early on. So, like with the death of James Connolly, um, unavoidably perhaps by his execution by the British after the Easter Rising, deprived the Irish communist movement of its greatest leader, which is I think there is a case to be made that communism in Ireland perhaps didn't recover from his loss for a very long time. If somehow he could have survived, I mean, like Eamon de Valera survived. I mean, I know Connolly was very, very badly wounded in the Easter Rising, though. If he had survived into the period after the Bolshevik Revolution, perhaps the Irish Communist Party could have had better leadership and a more solid foundation. Again, I'm speculating. If Irish comrades have other points of view that they want to counter mine with, feel free to add them. Also, I think it's fair to say that the loss of the anti-treaty side in the Irish Civil War weakened the development of a communist party in Ireland. Partition weakened it as well. The struggle against partition, of course, drew in a lot of communists, both within the occupied six counties and in the Irish Free State. But partition also damaged, to a certain extent, the development of a communist party in Ireland. I think the continued British presence in the north meant that the national liberation struggle wasn't concluded, which again complicated the development of communist parties in Ireland. I would also say that the way that the stunted way that Irish capitalism developed or didn't develop had an impact here as well. The continued waves of migration out of Ireland after independence as well took a lot of like the best working class fighters and took them to the United States, to Canada, to Australia, to New Zealand, and elsewhere. So like continued like migration out of Ireland has always been a weapon that first the British and then the Irish ruling class have used to dilute and to divert and to destroy communist parties or working class struggle. Mass migration out of the country has always been the weapon that they've used. So, and also the development of Irish capitalism. So, like, if you look at like post-independence Ireland, there's arguments to be made that the Irish ruling class actually engaged in deindustrialization, and again under the pressure of the British, who wanted to keep Ireland an agricultural backwater. Basically, that's what the British wanted. One that could still, even though it was independent, serve the requirements of the British Empire by reinforcing its status as a provider of agricultural goods to mainland Britain, and to not industrially develop. Now, the De Valera era did see like attempts to industrially develop Ireland, but I think only to a small degree of success. And then you got the change to like a sort of ultra financialized economy in the 1990s, which again didn't help with the development of, and again in a profoundly reactionary period, didn't help with the development of a coherent communist party in Ireland. Anyway, there is an Irish Communist Party, but as the last I knew of that, the last check-in I did on that, it had come to be dominated by a collection of like gender ideologues and petty reactionaries who dominate a lot of so-called communist parties. There is, of course, the Workers' Party of Ireland, who I've met some of the comrades from there who are very. There was a very good comrades who. Many of whom are Marxist-Leninists. So there is that organisation which still exists both in the occupied six counties and in the Irish Republic. So there are organisations trying to overcome this, but that would be my response to Tim's question as to the reasons why a more coherent, large-scale Irish Communist Party hasn't developed. And of course, I haven't even talked extensively about the legacy of the Irish struggle from like the late 60s through to the late 90s, 30 years, where I think a lot of energy of like the best elements of the Irish working class, again in the occupied six counties in the south, went into the armed struggle, which by its very nature was one that was focused on achieving a unified Irish Republic. And a lot of the men and women who fought in that struggle regarded themselves as communists of various different descriptions, but there was a lot of people in that movement who were very much not. There was some who were out and out reactionaries on everything except the question of Irish unity, as is always going to be the case in these broad-based national liberation organizations. So you have a lot of the people who would have been drawn to a communist party joining the IRA, joining Sinn Féin, and going through that struggle and into the political struggle of the 90s, and either accepting the Sinn Féin leadership's relentless march to the right, which is what it's been doing for many years now, or dropping into disillusionment and dropping out of political struggle because of that relentless march to the right. And so, of course, you have a position now where Sinn Féin is becoming more and more openly pro-NATO. I mean, that's why they've been doing all this shit about the Ukraine war, doing pro-Ukraine war stuff, which is just disgusting. Doing anti-Russia demonstrations, which is repulsive. So I think all of those factors are in the mix as to why communist parties in Ireland have been small and often isolated. What do you think of Shahid Bolson? I think he's a paid propagandist for the UAE, who took the role of paid propagandist for the UAE rather than facing a murder charge and the consequences for that. He's a petty paid reactionary and needs to be disregarded. That's my response to that question. Right, so I'm going to go scrolling back up the comments here to see if I've missed anything. Right, just banning some more idiot reactionaries here as I go. Okay. James Cook asks, will a new squatting movement after they had after World War II be a good idea? Would expose the lack of affordable housing BS, if nothing else? Yeah, I mean, thinking about it, I mean, there was the large-scale squatters movement after World War II did force the building of council housing. And there are, I mean, infamously in Britain, there's a lot of empty premises. Not of empty premises. Sorry, empty promises. Freudian slip if ever there was one. Yeah, I mean, if you look at like all the empty properties that exist, like it would be a very progressive thing, in fact, a revolutionary thing, to organize those who are without permanent accommodation, who are stuck in like shit temporary accommodation, or who are homeless, to essentially break into perhaps empty properties and occupy them on a not just on an individual basis, but on a mass basis, that would seriously panic the government here, and would like force the debate over force the issue of housing into a new light. So suddenly, it couldn't just be said that there was a shortage of housing, because there's not, and what would be exposed would be the fact that this shortage had been artificially created. So it is something which does have some progressive potential. Certainly, something that's worth discussing amongst ourselves as to how that could be done. Yes. Dmitry Chenish says, incompatibility of the interests of the bourgeoisie and the workers. How would you address this in the case of Russia? Some workers take the position they not support their ruling class in the SMO. Well, this is I was talking principally in response to Florida Man's question about like Britain and the US. In the case of a place like Russia, where it is under siege from imperialism, where the plots against it are manifest, that there is a slightly different calculation that needs to be made. So there is in Russia a national bourgeois that has committed itself to the struggle via the Putin Bonapartist regime, and therefore, I mean, this is the line that the KPRF takes. So I think it's worth reading their material on this point. That as far as a bourgeoisie in a country that is under siege by imperialism is prepared to engage in a struggle of national defense, then it can be supported to an extent, but never to the point where communists pretend that the interests of the two, even the national bourgeoisie and the proletariat, are going to continue to be compatible. I mean, this is where I would say the KPRF have done quite a good job of delineating this, which is that you have a shared interest in defeating the US imperialists, but that interest also diverges at key points, which is that even the national bourgeois in Russia is like still, due to the nature of its interests, still desperate to take a deal with imperialism when one is offered. And that's certainly the case and remains the case. So and again, we go back to like the classic examples, such as like the struggle in China prior to struggle against Japanese militarism, where you had a bourgeoisie that was rabidly hostile to the Communist Party, but which was also obliged to struggle against Japanese militarism. And therefore, the communists offer an alliance against Japanese militarism to the bourgeois elements and their supporters, and in a way that seeks to draw away workers and peasants who are invested in national bourgeois organizations, because they think that that's what's going to lead the struggle against imperialism. So the question's more complicated in countries that are under attack by imperialism in some ways than it is in imperialist countries, where that stark choice can be demonstrated more clearly. In other countries, it's a little more complicated. Mm-hmm. Agricola says, I heard Pablo Escobar, that's a Freudian slip there, you mean Pepe Escobar, say that Putin allegedly told Vitkov in Moscow that Russia wants lasting peace with the US and defines spheres of influence between US, Russia, and China. Bad news. Well, first of all, I would say that in response to that, that's Pepe Escobar. Pepe Escobar says a lot of things, some of which are wildly wrong, some of which are based on sources that exist only inside his own head. And he's also wildly overexcitable. So approach anything he says with a good degree of caution, I would say. Secondly, do certain elements within the Russian national bourgeoisie want this? Yes. This is what they've been calling for since 2007. This is what produced the Putin speech in 2007, where where Putin stood up at the Munich Security Conference and said, on behalf of the Russian national bourgeois, we are prepared to have you invest in heavy inverted commas, in Russia, as long as you respect our interests. But of course, the US imperialists neither can nor will ever really respect the interests of the Russian national bourgeois, not in this situation. The problem is that even if, say, Vitkov and Trump wanted to go for this, and some in the Trump orbit do want to go for this, some of them who can at least see that the U.S. imperialism is in trouble and needs to pursue alternative tactics. This is a problem for them, though, because the sensible retreat from empire that some of the so-called realists keep going on about isn't an option for U.S. imperialism. Because if you try and do the stuff maybe that J.D. Vance wants to do, or maybe that people that some others around Trump want to do, which is withdraw from expensive overseas military commitments and stop backing what Trump has called the forever wars, well, then the system collapses. If you can't, as U.S. imperialism, if it can't extract profit in the way that it does at the moment from anywhere in the world, and using military force to back up its profit, its claims on territories, and its ability to extract profit, then the system will disintegrate. There's not enough of a national industrial base to fall back on. You would have a wholesale collapse of U.S. financial institutions. Now, some may say good, and that would be correct, but you also have to bear in mind that that's not the way the ruling class will see it. The ruling class are going to undermine and destroy Trump, not because Trump wants to destroy U.S. capitalism, but because Trump, via doing things like these tariffs, is destabilizing things for the rest of the ruling class. So he will be brought to heel, or he will be disposed of in the end, one way or the other. So even if Trump and Vitkov wanted to offer Russia this thing that the Russian national bourgeois are after, which is this sort of sphere of influence grand bargain with the US, with Russia, and with China, the US cannot honor that deal, even if they signed it. They can't honor something which gives China a legitimate sphere of interest. They can't. They need the destruction of Russia, China, and Iran, and the looting and the asset stripping of these countries, just to try and revive themselves. There's no other way that imperialism can do it, other than by reducing the imperial core working class to the status of slaves, and that wouldn't necessarily work either. So even if this is offered, even if this is true and what Pepe Escobar says is correct, even if this is what the Russian national bourgeois are after, they won't get it. Trump might offer it, but he can't honor it, and nor can anyone else who is inside the machinery of the U.S. government. The crisis is too deep. As I said in my previous program, they're going to try and revive the Ukraine war somehow. They'll want to stage some kind of provocation against the Chinese. They'll want to stage some kind of provocation against the Iranians, even if they can't win it, even if they can't win the subsequent war. Imperialism is too deep in a hole to offer these fantasy bargains that the so-called realists, who aren't very realistic, keep going on about. They can't honor this. So the Russian national bourgeois might want to take some kind of deal that they think that Trump is offering them, but Trump can't enforce it, and it can't be used to bind U.S. imperialism into the kind of agreements that the Russian national bourgeois are looking for, or that those within China who want to deal with U.S. imperialism are looking for. They're all going to end up being profoundly disappointed because the system's too deep in the hole to make agreements. Anything which constrains their actions is going to be regarded as a threat by many in the system and is going to be eroded and destroyed. In this case, the struggle in Ukraine is going to have to be ended militarily by the Russians on the battlefield. I think you examine the Russian system, and there are many tendencies within it, not just the bourgeois tendencies who want the deal, but also those who understand that exactly what I've just said, that no deal is possible, and that U.S. imperialism will not abide by any deal that it signs. Again, the crisis is too great for that. And so we'll see how that translates into reality. I think that what's going to ultimately happen is that Trump will dance about around the idea of some kind of deal, but there are too many people in the US system who are aware of the fact that they don't want a deal, they don't need a deal, they need the destruction of Russia, China, and Iran. And that means continued rabid hostility and provocations. So Trump will not get his deal. Can you please answer Carter's question on being a transportation mechanic with good benefits and exploitation? Would that constitute productive labor? I haven't seen the question. For some reason, it's not showing up on my on the. Hang on. Yeah, we're on live chat, aren't we? So, but is a mechanic productive labor? I mean, I would say ultimately, hang on. Ultimately, like skilled working class labor, like mechanics or something like that. So, like a mechanic who works on like domestic cars, which is like maintaining a commodity, or like a mechanic who works on like in like transportation, so like working on like legit in areas that are related to logistics. Does that constitute productive labor? Well, is it directly involved in the process of commodity production? Is the question. And the answer would be maybe not, or definitely not, because you're not directly engaged in commodity production. You're engaged in the maintenance of vehicles that are engaged in the delivery of commodities. So you're certainly engaged in the process of delivering finished commodities to people. But the fact is that mechanics do have a good degree of industrial power if they're working on transportation. So mechanics, for instance, who work on um, uh, trucks or vans that are involved with delivery of goods, they have a good degree of industrial power because without them, like vans and trucks don't get repaired and the delivery process slows down. And because given that everything is just in time delivery, that could have a severe impact on the profits of various different delivery and logistics companies. Mechanics who work on the maintenance and repair of aircraft, for instance, have a good degree of industrial power. Because again, without them, if they walk out on strike, that means airlines can't fly. So your job can fall under a definition of non-productive because like you're not directly involved in the process of manufacturing commodities. But at the same time, you could still have a good degree of industrial power because of your place within the supply chain or your place as a repair worker for either public transport or logistics or air transport or something like that. So there's a lot of contradictory elements involved in like defining like what kind of labor that such a person is doing. But like a mechanic might not be involved in commodity production, but they have a great deal more power than, say, a service worker. It's like even though a mechanic could be defined as a service worker, and in many definitions of what a worker is or what kind of work somebody does, they will be defined as the provider of a service rather than a worker on a production line or a worker in the extraction industries. But certain service workers have more impact upon production and distribution of goods than others. So, like as I said, mechanics going on strike, that's more impactful than say Starbucks workers going on strike. Like if you got like truck drivers who are engaged in like the delivery of goods, they technically are providers of services, but because they're delivering goods, not working in either extracting the material required to build them, or taking part in the commodity production process, but they're absolutely crucial for delivering things. Or you could argue that the truck drivers are perhaps part of the doing productive labor because without them, a lot of the goods, a lot of the minerals and materials needed to do the productive labor don't get to the factories in the first place. But whether you describe them as productive labor or not, or that they are providing a service, they've still got a hell of a lot of industrial power because, again, the national truck drivers strike either in Britain or the United States or anywhere would shut down huge areas of the economy because you couldn't deliver anything. Just like, I mean, I used to work many years ago in like a in the supermarket trade, and when the truck drivers went on strike, literally like the food doesn't get to the shops, everything falls to pieces. So even if you're defining them as a service sector worker, they've still not all service sector workers are equal, because some occupy like a crucial place in the supply chain, which makes them very important to organize and very important to win over to communist politics. Like truck drivers and delivery men going on strike have traditionally had huge impacts inside the United States. I think it was the Minneapolis Teamsters strike of the 1930s that was one of the biggest and most important struggles of that period, which had a huge impact on things. So whether somebody is technically within the definition of of productive labor or not doesn't always necessarily marry up to whether they have industrial power or not. Yes, the production line workers and miners and oil rig workers, if they stop material flowing, that can have an immediate impact upon profits, and therefore that gives them a lot of industrial power. But also, like certain people who technically do provide services have a lot of industrial power as well, depending upon their place within the economic organizations of the capitalists. So it's not always just a cut and dried thing of whether somebody is technically providing productive labor or not. It's also their potential industrial power that should guide us in terms of our judgments as to like what are the key sectors of labor to actually organize. Okay. Okay. Edward says alcoholism was a major problem in the late USSR. My parents talk about the fact that some workers had a tradition to go to their garages after work and drink all night. Well, as has been covered on the this program before, the alcoholism in the USSR was actually encouraged by the Khrushchevite revisionists as a cheap way of making money by taxing alcohol and encouraging its sale. So, disaster and yet another disastrous legacy of Khrushchevite revisionism. Irish Partisan makes the good point, which is there is no way the British and reactionary Free State forces would have allowed Connolly to remain alive. You are probably correct, Irish Partisan. There was a lot of certainly the British were never going to let him live, and there's a lot of people in the reactionary Irish ruling class who didn't want him to remain alive either. It's a good point. Do I know the Socialism for All group are? No, I don't. So I'll have to look at them before I could make a judgment. Eddie asked, what is going on with Trump and the capitalists? I'm confused about everything that is happening. But what's going on is the fact that there is a division in the American capitalist class about the way to resolve their crisis. Now, Trump has been brought in. Part of the reason why he's been brought in anyway is to try to find a way out of the Ukraine war that doesn't make it look as if they've lost, even though they have, but also to try and find a way to resolve the problems that the capitalists know they have with regard to domestic industry. Now, Biden, I should say the Biden administration, was also trying to solve this problem. Biden didn't get rid of all Trump's tariffs from last time, particularly on steel, and was trying to encourage the development of domestic industrial production inside the United States again. So the Democrats did actually have an industrial policy. It didn't work, or it worked only in a tiny, very limited way. And so, like, there is a long-term, or fairly long-term recognition now from part of the U.S. ruling class that the deindustrialization does represent a bit of a problem for them, and that the fact that China is the workshop of the world presents a bit of a problem for them. The issue is that with the ruling class, they don't know what to do about it. Because to actually do something about it would mean to examine the reasons why the US deindustrialized itself. And that's related to the very nature of US capitalism developing into US imperialism, which always has the follow-on from that being that that there is a significant amount of deindustrialization. And the capitalist class don't want to deal with that, can't deal with that. And the confused responses of Biden and Trump and their administrations are a product of the fact that they don't know what to do. And so Biden had his policies. Trump, again, has his policy, which he's influenced by people like Navarro, Myron, etc. And again, there's never just one motivation to do anything, which is again part of the issue here. The point is, though, that like Trump and his group, part of them anyway, thought that they could bolster US imperialism by putting the tariffs on. Partly, they thought that they would be able to encourage domestic investment in the redevelopment of industry. They won't. Partly, they thought they were going to get a windfall from the money that was raised through the tariffs. They're not. Partly, though, and I think this is the biggest reason why the tariffs were put on, it's the amping up of the war against China. They thought that by putting all these tariffs on Chinese goods, they could damage the economic development of China. Turns out they can't. Turns out the Chinese were ready for them. So those are the motivations. The capitalist class had a variety of motivations for bringing Trump in, and Trump's group had a variety of motivations for doing what they've done. The biggest single one, though, is the war against China, just as it was with Biden, because that's the overarching problem that they've got, which is that the Chinese have now gotten too strong and they're desperate to try and put them back in their place or to destroy them entirely, and they just can't do it. Which is why you've got all these confused responses. It's why you've got all these crazy bullshitting going on from like Trump and others. It's why you've ultimately got this problem now that Trump's created, or the Trump group created, which is that they're trying to undermine China and ultimately have undermined themselves, because what they've revealed is like some big weaknesses that a lot of even their allies don't regard the dollar as a stable investment anymore. So this is what happens when a ruling class knows that it's got problems, tries various ways to solve them, and none of them work. So always bear in mind that a ruling class and their intellectuals can understand that they've got a problem, can understand that they need to do something about it, but the very nature of their interests means that they can't do the things that they would need to do to ultimately revive themselves, which is all about using essentially state-based investment and planning to restore domestic industry, because the capitalists aren't going to restore it on their own. But again, that would mean that a US government would have to come in that would be essentially Bonapartist enough to defy pressure from the ruling class, to override their interests, and to use like state-based investment and planning to rebuild US industry. No one's going to do that. Trump's not going to do that. The Democrats aren't going to do that. Bernie fucking Sanders ain't going to do that, because that would again run into the fundamental interests of the US ruling class. So they're stuck. And this is what happens when they're stuck. They start to turn to various different utopian solutions or crazy solutions to their problems. And ultimately, though, the biggest reason for any action that any US government takes is a wish to isolate and destroy their enemies, and to destroy those countries that are the biggest problem for them. Chinese, the Russians, and then just behind that, Iran, the DPRK, Venezuela, and others. That's what is going on here. But the root cause is, of course, the long-term crisis of US imperialism and the fact the US ruling class doesn't know what to do, or can't embrace the solutions that might address the problem because of the nature of their interests. But they do recognize there is a problem. But again, they don't know what they can't embrace the solutions that would be there. So they turn to various different utopian points of view, like those expressed by Navarro or those expressed by like people associated with Biden, etc. Could you have a go at my cooperatives question, please? Says Entropy Juggler. Well, could you cut and paste the question further on down the chat, please? Because I seem to have not seen it for some reason. Daft Tarzan says Pepe revealed himself as a Nazi by claiming he thought he was in Africa when he visited Paris on the Larry Johnson show. Yeah, he's a fucking cheap reactionary. A lot of these multipolar guys are fucking cheap reactionaries who have marketed themselves as like fucking revolutionary somehow or whatever. But like Escobar's just a cheap, dirty old reactionary who is essentially a European chauvinist. I know he's Colombian, I think, by nationality, but like a lot of them are profound European chauvinists who want to go back to some like 1950s or 1970s version of like France or West Germany or Britain. Like these are cheap reactionaries who don't understand imperialism. And like, why is it that there are so many people of African or North African or West Asian origin in France? Well, most of them come from areas that the French occupied or repressed for many years. That'd be why. Pepe, if you'd bothered to study anything other than the bottom of a fucking cocktail glass for the last 40 years, you might know that. Right, just going through. Some more questions here. Right. Okay. Bear with me a moment. I'm just having to scroll up and down the chat. Right. Okay. Tracy Wilkinson says, I also believe Russia should continue with the special military operation until they reach Kiev and keep the US and NATO out. Well, they're going to have to, whether they want to do that or not. That's going to be the only way they're going to be able to secure a victory. Like the various people in the Russian system might be desperate to accept some kind of deal, but there is the countervailing pressure within the Russian system, and also within the wider Russian polity of like that. There is going to be possibly like tens over 100,000 Russians who have died in this war. And if the Russian government is seen to have capitulated to the US, not on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table, that's going to be a severe problem for not just Putin, but his potential successor. And the Europeans and the US can't afford to look as if they've lost the war. So they're not going to offer the kind of deal that the Russians will be able to accept, because the Russians have kind of like dug themselves a bit of a hole in that they've said, quite correctly, no NATO for Ukraine. But if the answer from the US and the Europeans is, okay, well then how about this multinational peacekeeping force? The US, of course, won't contribute to it themselves, but some kind of like NATO force in the west of Ukraine. Well, that's basically like NATO in the west of Ukraine, especially if it's the west creeps all the way up to the Kiev area. Now, the Russians, well, I think the Russian leadership has written off like the bits of Ukraine that used to be part of old Austria-Hungary in the far west, where Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania have their historic territorial claims. but the great bulk of like Ukraine, they're going to want and need to keep their NATO forces out of there. The only way you do that is by dismantling the Kiev regime by force and reorganizing some version of a Ukrainian state that is anti-NATO, that is anti-US, that is bound to the Russians by treaty, and in terms of mutual defense, like Belarus is. So that is probably going to be the only way they're going to be able to do it, and that they leave the west of Ukraine as a poisoned pill for Poland to swallow, which many Polish reactionaries will happily do. But the US will not be able to offer a deal which the Russians will be able to take at this stage, I don't think. So ultimately, the Kiev regime will have to be destroyed because the Russians can't leave it there. Because if they leave it there, then the Brits and the French and the Germans and the US behind the scenes are going to rearm it and throw it again at the Russians in a few years' time. So you'll have fought this war, and many Russians will have died, not to mention, of course, God knows how many Ukrainians, and it will be seen as being for nothing. So the Putin system and certain forces within it might want a deal, but they're not going to get one because the US can't give one. Marius says, the Hillary wing of the Democrats hated this industrial policy, and it was because of their influence that the Democrats never talked about it during the 2024 campaign, despite the fact that it was one of Biden's few positive achievements. Interesting. Okay. Matt Vollmer says, tariffs are just another tax, just an import tax. The narrative lies to people, making us think they have duties. Yeah, it's a tax on workers, basically. Michael Russell says, I've started to organise working class communities who live in public housing around the idea of a public forum that bypasses local housing authority. Well, good for organising people within, and good for making the issue of housing into a proper class politics issue. Michael says, is direct democracy the best way to proceed, comrades, or should I be more selective about participation? Don't want to give advice on that because I'm not fully aware of the specifics of your situation. So if you want more on that, email me the details and I'll take a look at it and give you a proper response, because I don't want to be speculating to you on what seems to be a real struggle that you're engaged in. Just going through. Some more here. Belarus does not want and cannot allow NATO states taking the Lvov Rivne regions. That would leave Belarus encircled from three sides, and Baltics, Poland, Romania, Hungary in Lvov. Interesting point. I'm sure that point has been made to the Russians by the Belarusians on numerous occasions. Greetings to Aid in Mexico. Good to have you with us. Jerry says, John Helmer reckons there'll be an area around Lvov as an Idlib-like area. Well, the problem with that, I would say the Idlib comparison is going to be a little bit wrong, given that essentially that will be then outside of any new Ukrainian state. The problem the Syrian state had was that you had an area that was de facto independent, but they still claimed sovereignty over, but they couldn't ever reassert sovereignty over it for a variety of reasons, including certain mistakes that I think were made there. If the Russians then constitute a new version of the Ukrainian state, not only will that be more stable than what the Syrian state was left with, but also the Lvov configuration, whatever way the imperialists dress it up, is going to be very unstable, and will end up um, only with like the imperialists falling out amongst themselves as to what to do with it. Uh, what else we got here? Richard Wolff thinks that the USSR and China are examples of Marx's claim that the system won't die until all possible variations have been tried. Well, Wolff's an interesting one. He's a reformist, principally, um, who tends towards, I would say, more Keynesian explanations of things. So, like, I don't. It's the reason why I can't watch his stuff. It's like I find it very overly simplistic, and I don't think social democratic explanations actually do any good now, because it relies upon the fiction that a social democratic way out can be found inside the United States, and that's just not the reality. You know, liberty or death, to quote an American Revolution of the past. Um, yeah, I find Wolff to be pedantic and overly simplistic. Um, Now, I find the explanation as to why the USSR failed, his explanation, to be inadequate, to say the least, and prove that he is influenced by various reformist trends that were anti-Soviet. The idea that like every single permutation has to be played out before the system can be dropped, that doesn't work. It doesn't work because like history is not that mechanistic. That's a version of Marxist analysis which is too mechanistic, which is too determinist, which is too crudely materialist, to be honest. That's what I find about that explanation. Um, uh, can you comment on Michael Hudson's declaration that no Marxist has ever been interested in finance capital? I think Hudson is a reactionary. Um, I find Hudson to be well, he's not a Marxist, first and foremost. Hudson isn't a Marxist. He might have read a lot of Marx, but I find his claims about what Marx wrote rather dubious, to be honest. As an economic historian, as I've said many times, he does interesting work. But as a Marxist, no, there's no value to him as a Marxist because he's not a Marxist. I find his absolutely ludicrous views on imperialism to be damaging, to be wrong. His dismissal of Lenin is absolutely ludicrous because he claims to be interested in financialization, but neglects Lenin's work on the importance of finance capital, on the development of finance capital. Because Hudson wants to make the argument that there is a way to essentially a reformist way to develop to socialism via the concentration on industry. And he doesn't seem or doesn't want to reckon with the Leninist arguments about the way in which capitalism in Britain, France, Germany, the United States evolved into imperialism. He doesn't seem to want to deal with that. He chalks it up to like the bad bankers or the bad decisions that were made, or that it's the work of a sort of clique of financializers. Not that it's an organic process whereby capitalism has deindustrialization and capital export built into it as a naturally occurring tendency within capitalism. Hudson doesn't want to deal with that because he wants to peddle the fiction that you can have a peaceful transition from industrialization towards some kind of socialism, which again is a reactionary fantasy. It reduces financialization down to, like, again, the bad decisions of individuals under the pressure of banking cliques, which again is wrong. And I don't trust anyone who claims to be any kind of Marxist who essentially dismisses one of the most important, if not the most important, developments in Marxist theory in the last 120 years, which is the the Leninist understanding of imperialism. If you dismiss that, then I think you're a cheap reactionary, no matter what, um, politically speaking, no matter what like historical benefit your analysis might have. And I don't think that Marxists should be holding up Hudson as some kind of great example of Marxist economics because he's not a Marxist. I don't think he does. I don't know if he even claims to be one. I've seen him describe himself as a classical political economist. So yeah, his historical work has a lot of interest to it, but his analysis of the current situation and his analysis of imperialism is straight up wrong, and he's actually reactionary. And I would say that those who have elevated him should reassess their calculations. Let's have a look. Yeah, Las Maria says Lenin wrote so much about finance capital. It's such and it is a silly claim. It's a silly claim because like Hudson doesn't want to deal with Lenin's work, so he has to claim that nobody other than him wants to deal with financialization. But like Lenin, Stalin, and others like who dealt with analyzing imperialism, of course, dealt with what finance capital was. But Hudson doesn't want to go near any of that because I think partially because of his Trotskyite origins, and so has to make the ludicrous claim that like, oh, only I've dealt with this. So he ends up making himself look ridiculous. What do I think of Michael Roberts? There's an interesting. He has some interesting articles. I think that his politics are all over the place, like many who come from like the Trotskyite tradition, which is where I think Roberts comes from. I've found some value in his work. His work on the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, I think he's quite interesting. But politically, I find him to be like confused and all over the place. Like he's like doom mongering over climate change. Like he's distinctly unscientific, to be honest. Which is it shows that like Western Marxism is wildly inconsistent. His approach to like political questions often falls into reformism. Not that you can't get stuff out of his economic analysis, because some of his economic analysis is quite good. Again, I recommend his work on like the tendency of the rate of profit to fall is interesting for its thorough explanation of what that is and what it means. But again, the man has his limitations. Uh, right, just going through some more questions here. Uh, Pavel says, I think I've seen an interview with Hudson where he described himself as a Trotskyite because Stalin was too extreme, which proves that Hudson is a rather silly man, to be honest, because Stalin, again, like the idea that Stalin was just this bad guy doing bad things and was too extreme. Like, well, again, that proves Hudson's a bit of a fool because look at the solutions that Trotsky was suggesting in the early 1920s. Like, Trotsky was like suggesting that the state should run the trade unions and that trade unions should just be organs which ordered workers to do things. He favored literal forced at gunpoint collectivization. Whereas Stalin consistently made the point that the peasantry had to be brought around to the point of view of the party via persuasion. So, like, Trotsky was actually the extremist that his followers claimed that Stalin was. Stalin had to reckon with the requirements of socialism in power, like, but Hudson's a petty utopian, so he's perfect for the Trotskyite movement. Edward asks, can you debunk the claim that if only a country has a national development bank through crediting and printing it can become rich, and that's how the Western states became rich? Well, look, having a national bank and being in control of your own currency is part of the reason why, like Britain, France, and others became like successful capitalist nations. but also it is like industrialization via the massive dispossession of the peasantry, via the concentration of land ownership, via the dispossession and extermination of native peoples in Central, Northern, and Southern Americas in particular. There's so much more as to why capitalism became a successful mode of production that it has done. There's so much more to it than just saying you need a national bank or a unified credit creation process. Like, yeah, that's part of it, but without the industrial base to go with that, then that national bank isn't worth very much, is it? And so the process of actually forming like the mass industrialization of Britain took like many years and took like mass, as I said, dispossession of the proletariat, of the peasantry, driving the peasantry off common land, enclosing land, literally reducing peasants to the status of slaves, forcing people into the new industrial cities en masse. All of these things play their part in making British and French and US capitalism into what they were. Just literally saying you can have a national bank and print your way to wealth. Again, that's like that's MMT Keynes style rubbish, basically. Like we get a lot of people who like take very simplistic points of view as to like why capitalist nations became the successes that they did, and again, this needs to be explained more thoroughly as to what made capitalism into the system that it is. Uh, have you seen, asks Schizo, Elvira Berry? She makes what I think to be a false claim that unity of the different SSRs stem purely from propaganda and Tsarist methods were used by the Soviet Union to stop independence. Um, that's well, I don't know who Elvira Barry is. To be honest, never heard of her. But again, this is Trotskyite stuff. Like the revolutions and the republics were real, and also the Soviet nationality policy was significantly different, provably so, in most of the republics. If you look at the respect for national cultures, the respect for national religions, that just wasn't there under the Tsardom. The promotion of national languages, national alphabets, national literature, national culture in the Soviet republics that again didn't exist under the Tsardom. So these claims are provably wrong. If you look at the way that the different cultures, religions, and languages were treated under the Soviet system, again, like all the claims that it's just a repetition of the Tsardom, that's a fantasy. That's Trotskyite nonsense. Agricola says, I heard Hudson say the current left stops at Capital Book 1 and should understand Book 2 and Book 3, which it impacts on the left strategy, which I agree with, but also see how he skips over Lenin. Well, as Hudson ever addressed the early part in Volume 2, where Marx and then a later footnote by Engels chart how capitalism and the capitalist class will always be seized from time to time by fevers, which make them want to cut out commodity production entirely. Has he ever dealt with that? I mean, if he has, then send me the video, because like Marx, the critiques of and the development of like the theory of Marx by Lenin are all rooted in Marx, and like I yeah, I don't see how like Hudson can like keep saying like, oh, this is all because I've read Book 2 and Book 3 and you haven't. He's very selective in his application of Book 2, at the very least. Uh, but we'll see. I mean, if he's addressed that point, then let me know. But I don't think he has. Um, Chris Adams says, would Russia have been better off by saying to the US, if you put missiles in Ukraine, we'll put them back on Cuba? That would depend upon the attitude of the Cuban government, wouldn't it? You can't just say we're going to put missiles back on Cuba if the Cuban government doesn't agree to that. But also, to answer Chris's point, the the pressure to use Ukraine against Russia would still have been there. So like the only way really that this is going to be dealt with now, or was ever going to be dealt with by 2022, because things were too far gone by that stage, was a war that finished off the Kiev regime. And to be honest, the Russians should have just piled in and finished off the Kiev regime quicker than they have done. This like torturous process has only ended up by killing many, many more hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, which Putin keeps saying to them that they are a brotherly people. Well, then the kind of way to deal with the Ukrainians would have been to go in harder, quicker, and to destroy the Kiev regime quicker than they have done. One of the reasons why the war has dragged on as long as it has, partly it's because like the US and the British and the French and the Germans have thrown everything at propping the Kiev regime up and keeping the war going. But it's partly because of the Russian tactics of they keep looking for a negotiation. They keep looking for a bargain to be made, and there isn't one to be made. So at each stage, the Russians have hedged because they think a bargain's on the table, or that there's going to be a restoration of sanity in the White House, or that somebody's going to bargain with them, and no bargain is available that they can possibly accept. That's the problem. And again, like I think the KPRF are right about this, which is that the problem is that there is a bourgeois faction in the Russian government that keeps thinking they're going to get some kind of bargain, and no bargain is available. And they've ended up being far crueler to Ukraine in this long, drawn-out war than they would have been had they knocked it over inside a few weeks or a few months, which would have taken a much greater mobilization of forces than they had available to them at the time, and certainly would have created more problems, and certainly they would have faced a lot of difficulties. But that Kiev regime was way weaker than it looked. The only reason why it's able to be propped up is because essentially the Russian government allowed the NATO bloc to build up those forces inside Ukraine, but that politically the Ukrainian regime was very, very weak and could have been knocked over a lot quicker than might have been the case. Even the imperialists in the early stages thought it was going to get knocked over very quick. They genuinely did think that. But again, the Russian system, it moves in such a way as to always look for a deal. And the problem with an implacable, desperate opponent in the form of the US, not the Kiev regime, they are unimportant in this regard. Problem with the US imperialists is that they can't have a deal with the Russians that the Russians would in any way find acceptable. The Russian bourgeoisie, even the national bourgeoisie, doesn't want to acknowledge that point and is closing its eyes to it and sticking its fingers in its ears, trying to pretend that there's some other way around this. And there's not. There's not. And so Putin's the crap that he talks sometimes about, oh, there are a brotherly people, etc., etc. Well, you haven't treated them like that. You've treated them. You've ended up like killing far more of them and having to kill far more of them than would have been the case had another option been pursued 3 years ago. But by constantly looking for a deal and by constantly looking to negotiate their way out of an unnegotiable situation, like the US and the Russians can agree not to fucking nuke each other. You know, we're not. This is to answer the Scott Ritter point. The US and the Russians can agree not to nuke each other and can agree to that this isn't going to escalate into a wider war. That's the only thing that they can possibly agree. The US cannot give up the regime change struggle against the Russian Federation, and the Russian Federation cannot agree to the demands that the US is making of them, because the only demand the US is ever going to really make in negotiations is for total capitulation, either now or later, because that's what US imperialism requires. But because the Russian bourgeois can't and won't recognize that fact, or hasn't been willing to, this is lengthening the struggle and is lengthening the torture that Ukraine is being put through by the imperialists. Principally, it is principally their fault and the fault of the Ukrainian compradors. But the Russians could have knocked over that Ukrainian regime way quicker than they have done. But they have chosen to try and go about the war in a way that always leaves room for a negotiation, which, as Trump is proving now, cannot deliver anything. Okay. So I'm going to draw things to a conclusion for today. Thanks to the many of you who are watching. This program will be available in audio form on Patreon very soon. Be sure to join us later this week for the next episode in the reading group series on Kwame Nkrumah's work, Neocolonialism. That'll be on Thursday. And I'll be back tomorrow with another program in the evening. But until then, thank you for joining me. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and buy me a coffee. I'll be back with you again very soon. And until then, good night. Thanks for joining and solidarity.